All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I want to start by letting everyone know that this event is being recorded. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar, Schools, Prisons, Abolition, Youth of Color Organizing in Southern California. I'm Simeon Mann. I direct the Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies program at UC San Diego. UC San Diego occupies the unceded territory and ancestral remains of the Kumeyaay people. This event is being organized in honor of two concurrent moments, API Heritage Month and Abolition May. You might be familiar with API Heritage Month, but maybe less so with Abolition May. And so I just want to say a little bit about that. Abolition May is a month-long series of actions on campuses across North America or Turtle Island, demanding the removal of all campus police. And I want to acknowledge the incredible students, faculty, university workers who are organizing as part of the Cops Off Campus Coalition, which includes UC FTP and Cops Off Campus UCSD. They are helping us to imagine and to build toward a different university that does not thrive on policing, and showing us that an end to policing is not only possible, but also urgently necessary. I want to thank our staff who made this event possible, Anna Marie Buenviaje and Jen Schwarzkopf. I want to thank our co-sponsor for this event, Underground Scholars Initiative at UC San Diego, which supports incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, and system impacted people in pursuing higher education. I also want to thank Erin Ngan, my co-facilitator, who is an undergraduate student at UCSD majoring in ethnic studies and history. And I'm going to turn it over to Erin to give us some historical context.
Yeah, hi everyone. As Simeon said, welcome to the event. We're really excited to be talking about these really important issues today. So we've put together a few timelines side by side to highlight the relationships between histories often not discussed together. So these are histories that are happening simultaneously, not in a vacuum. A lot of times when you discuss history, we talk about, this is the history of prisons and how the prison industrial complex grew, but these things happen at the same time as, the wars in Southeast Asia and the Cold War and all of these things that really come together. On the left, we have a timeline of US militarism and immigration from the Pacific and Southeast Asia. And on the right, we have a timeline of policies relating to the criminalization of communities of color, largely due to the war on drugs and the 1994 crime bill introduced under Clinton. One of the objectives of the session today is to think about how these are intertwined, but also how this shapes the day-to-day lives of Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander communities in their lived experiences. And then here, we've put together a timeline of the development of the California State Prison, which is, you see on the right, and the University of California's investment into settler colonialism and militarization. We acknowledge policing as an extension of militarism. And so we tend to think about the university as a space that's outside of the relationships of prisons and carcerality, but in many ways, education is imagined as liberatory. Hashtag schools not jails is exemplary of this kind of thinking. However, if we look at UC policies, we see that they feed into prisons, being deeply invested in the maintenance and expansion of the prison industrial complex. Even abroad, we see the UC holding ties to corporations invested in, the Israeli settler occupation in Palestine, which is, more relevant than ever today. And so these violent profit-making relationships are insidious and they hide behind the narrative of progress and diversity in the university. So as we can see, we cannot separate these histories from one another. We must also recognize that they are recent and relevant, as we will hear from our speakers here today. But before we get started, we wanted to have you share your experiences with policing, even thinking about mundane forms of policing and surveillance. So I'm going to drop a link to a Padlet in the chat right now. We'll give you a couple minutes to fill that out. And then once we finish, we'll come back to the Padlet towards the end of today's conversation and ask another question during the Q&A section. But yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that right now.
All right, so as Aaron drops the Padlet link in the chat, and as you start filling it out, I am going to start introducing our speakers for today. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. I also just want to take a moment to thank each and every one of them for taking time out of their incredibly busy schedules, right, during this incredibly busy month to spend this hour and a half with us. So I will start with Paul Sulk, who is an organizer with Youth Justice Coalition. Paul works to dismantle policies that have caused the massive lockup and deportation of migrants. He was brought to the States as an infant child of Cambodian refugees and became parentless at 16. He was then pushed into the criminal legal system, tried as an adult, and sent to state prison. After 16 years inside, he was handed over to immigration enforcement for mandatory detention and deportation. He eventually was released under an order of deportation and became an impacted leader in the fight for an immigrant legal defense fund in Los Angeles. Through his work, the community and many elected officials' support, he received a pardon from Governor Brown in 2018. Today, he continues to organize with the Youth Justice Coalition to bring truth to the human effects of mass incarceration and mass deportation. Next, we have Tavae Samuelu, who is the daughter of a pastor from Luilu Moega and a nurse from Salemoa. As the executive director of Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, or EPIC, she's a passionate advocate for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders and is committed to liberation for all. Tavae was born and raised on Tongva land and credits her time on unceded Ohlone territory for her political identity and consciousness. Before joining EPIC, she served as the development director for the RISE, that's RYSE, Youth Center in Richmond, and has since become a member of RISE's board of directors. Tavae is also the vice president of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council and was recently elected to the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. The pandemic has taught her that her most important title is Auntie Vai. Next, we have Maggie Quan, who is a community organizer at Khmer Girls in Action, or KGA. For the last 24 years, KGA has built youth power and leadership to fight for racial, gender, and economic justice in Long Beach and across California. Maggie joined the organization in 2016, shortly after graduating from UC San Diego in 2015, with a major in human development and a minor in ethnic studies. Since joining KGA, she has been involved in various campaigns, including electoral justice campaigns and the start of the Invest in Youth Budget Equity campaign. She also supports the organization's narrative and communication strategy, centering young people's stories in their campaigns. In February 2021, the Invest in Youth campaign won a major victory by establishing the Long Beach Youth Fund. And last but not least, we have Vanessa Na, who is originally from Denver, Colorado, and is a first daughter of Khmer refugees. She's a Ph.D. student in education studies at UC San Diego. She has spent over a decade in community organizing and collective care efforts for Asian Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, Desi American communities, and communities of color. Her research focuses on the interrogation of and resistance to oppressive logics on college campuses through examinations of race and racism, women of color feminisms, and college student activism and solidarities. Vanessa enjoys spending much of her time with her partner and her dog, seeking boba coffee shops and standing Blackpink. All right. Thank you. Aaron, do you want to show the results of the poll, or should we move on? How do you want to do this?
I think we can move on. I can read a couple of the answers. So one of the answers is for talking about experiencing policing. One of the answers is my department at UCSD surveilling my online behavior, personal social media posts, etc. And then another response talks about the ways that that this person had facetiously remarked that going to school is in some ways like going to prison, but now that we're seriously discussing the connections between universities and prisons, that policing, surveillance, monitoring, and punishment is much more severe than they'd imagined, as well as the budget increases in UCPD, among other things.
All right, thank you for sharing. Yeah, as we continue today, like feel free to continue typing in that Padlet, and we'll have this like collective documentation of our reflections. So just a reminder, you can use the Q&A function at any time to ask a question of our panelists. We have a designated Q&A time at the end, but we can also just throw in questions whenever, as they arise, right? So the way that we have set this up is we want to keep this conversational, and we have 4 questions that we will be asking our panelists over the next hour. So I'm going to start with the first question. So to everybody, right? So tell us about yourself and the work that you're doing right now that is keeping you busy, that is keeping you grounded, right? So if I may just add a little bit more, like to be more specific, if you can share how have your or your community's experiences with policing, with prisons, how have that shaped who you are and brought you into this work? So if I can start with Paul.
Sure. Thank you for joining, everyone. Paul Sulk with the Youth Justice Coalition based in LA. Simeon was saying, I'm a child of Cambodian parents, right? And most Cambodians are in the United States because of American intervention over in, Southeast Asia. And so, unfortunately, we're here, and I'm here as a product of that violence, kind of that political violence, that state violence, governmental violence, et cetera. But in any case, landed here, just like many folks experience as refugees, you don't end up in places that are designed for you to thrive. You get placed in areas that are highly policed, highly surveilled, areas that are often, what they call plagued with crime, et cetera, places that are not supported, places that are designed for folks to fail. But in any case, I failed. I got caught up in that system that it was designed for me to do. That's why I say the system is not broken. It does what it is intended to do. And with that, I ended up in the system, 17 years old, got pushed out of school. We step out of my house, who was there? A man with a badge and a firearm, right? It wasn't like a system to support me or whatever. But, with that, I ended up being tried as an adult, went off to state prison, sat there for a while, sat there for a little while, and a little longer, and a little longer. Unfortunately, almost 2 decades. Got out a little early because folks were doing legislation to bring folks home, benefited from that. But, I wasn't born here, so I get to watch people go home while I get shackled and get put on a van to go to another place, to an ICE lockup, right? It's not a detention center. It's a migrant jail. It's a migrant prison. Let's just say it for what it is. It's a concrete box that just warehouses somebody while they're getting ready to send somebody out. But fortunately for me, because of the issues between Cambodia and the US, they weren't able to deport me at the time, and they had to release me. It took me a while to get to that place, but made it out under an order of deportation, under ICE supervision, and under California state parole. So I don't know about the land of the free. It didn't seem free when I walked out of that box. Surely wasn't. Had a lot of restrictions, had to go show up at the parole office and all kinds of stuff, right? Like immediately I had things to do in order to just not get back in a box. But anyways, that led to a longer story. But eventually I ended up getting connected with the young folks at YJC, Youth Justice Coalition, pulled me in, brought me into the work and got plugged in, been doing work ever since on the ground based on the experience of impacted folks. And through that work, I was able to get a pardon from Governor Brown in 2018. So still here, not on a plane, didn't get sent overseas, but only one of the few, right? That should be available for all folks. Liberation is for everybody. And until we get there, nobody's really free.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, and we'll hear a little bit more about your work with YJC hopefully later. But Maggie, how about you? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you're doing?
Yes, thank you for inviting KGA. So my name is Maggie Quan and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a community organizer at Khmer Girls in Action in Long Beach. I am the proud daughter of refugees from Vietnam and I grew up in Lincoln Heights, Los Angeles. I grew up in a low-income immigrant community and my family and community were impacted by the anti-youth, anti-poor, anti-immigrant policies of the 90s and 2000s. For example, I remember in 6th grade, my teachers being absent because they had to testify at my classmates' deportation hearings. And it was my classmate who sat right next to me too, among a lot of stuff happening back then. I also saw how young people my age resisted and fought against these policies. So they led powerful walkouts and I remember that the leaders who were as young as 8th graders would face threats of incarceration from their school officials. So that demonstration of youth power has never left me and is a large part of why I am a youth organizer today. So at KGA, we organize Southeast Asian and multiracial youth towards racial, gender, and economic justice in Long Beach. We primarily work with 2nd and 3rd generation Cambodian youth whose families survived war and genocide that Paul mentioned in Southeast Asia, and were violently resettled in under-resourced and over-policed communities. We were founded by Cambodian American girls in high school in 1997. We started out as a project that primarily focused on reproductive health issues, such as teen pregnancy. But once young women gathered through, they expressed that they faced challenges beyond teen pregnancy, right? They faced sexual harassment from institutions, intergenerational trauma, criminalization of poverty, and deportation orders of their loved ones, including parents and siblings who were of the 1st and 1.5 generation. These issues stem from all the policies that we mentioned before. These issues also stem from like our community struggles and how our community struggles are tied to those of many other communities of color. So when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, we call it the school to prison to deportation pipeline, and we analyze it through a race, class, and gender justice lens. And ever since our founding, we have regarded policing and deportation through a gender justice lens and how it impacts the safety and well-being of entire families and communities as a whole. Right? So for example, if we look at young Southeast Asian people in the 90s, and even till now, their families resettled in impoverished conditions, grew up having to navigate under-resourced and unsupportive school systems alone, which led them to being targeted for incarceration. They and their families are re-traumatized, having never had the resources and space to heal. Our youth in this case, in these cases, are often bridges between their families and the system of deportation, such as talking to lawyers and providing transportation, translation, financial, and emotional support. And so policing and prisons has never served or benefited our communities. They separate and harm families, punish young people, and perpetuate the cycle of poverty and intergenerational trauma. At KGA, our youth learn their history, make connections between their lives and systems of oppression, tell their stories, and fight for justice and healing for their community.
Thank you so much, Maggie. Such a privilege to learn from you and like to have KGA be a part of this panel. Yeah, so Vanessa, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you are doing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Simeon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to everyone in the audience who is here to learn with us, to grow with us, to move forward with us. I'm Vanessa. I'm the eldest daughter of Khmer refugees who eventually resettled in Denver. So if there are any other eldest daughters in this space, I know you know my pain, I know you know my struggles, and thank you so much for being here. I'm again, sister, a daughter, I'm apparently an auntie now to another dog, like all these family connections. When I grew up in Denver, I grew up in a predominantly Chicanx community. Because I was in Colorado, didn't really have a lot of contact with other Khmer folks. So even how I came to understand my Southeast Asian American identity is super complicated. And now being in California, where there are more Southeast Asian folks, where there are more Khmer folks, I'm renegotiating all of these things and all of these experiences. I'm also a PhD student right now in education studies at UC San Diego. I specifically study college students and college campuses. I was a public school student in Denver Public Schools, which is severely underfunded, much like all of public education. And I remember spaces with metal detectors, like metal gates, security guards on every corner. And they were supposedly there to keep us safe, but I think they were more likely there to monitor us and to ensure our compliance. And I think a lot about how these folks who were the security guards were often other people of color. And I think a lot about how the system of white supremacy and carcerality puts our communities in positions where we harm one another instead of care for each other. But it was also in these spaces where I got my first taste in youth organizing as a high school student, pushing for more socially just curriculum. I think part of why I'm still in this space, why I'm still pursuing a PhD in education studies, is because how I've experienced policing in educational and classroom spaces. I think that I spent a lot of time maintaining the university because I think, as Erin alluded to before, I really truly wanted to believe that the university was a benevolent space. I don't necessarily believe that to be true anymore. I'm still the only Southeast Asian American student in my program, despite being in the state of California. And I think because of that, I've reinvested a lot of my time and energy into underground university spaces, which I'll talk about later, and collective care networks, especially for women of color. And I think as we continue our conversation today, for us to continue thinking about this relationship between prisons and schools, specifically universities, even how they architecturally and culturally represent one another. Fun fact, architects who design prisons also design residence halls on college campuses. So you might notice if there are any college students in the space, your room and your space may represent some of these spaces and connections that we're talking about when we're speaking about carcerality in prisons. And again, I want to emphasize that more prisons than UCs have been constructed in the state of California in the past few decades. I think about how my time at UCSD as a PhD student, where my presence, both physically and online, have been surveyed by my department, by the institution, by the field as a whole. And it continues to bear a heavy presence in my life. So I often reflect on how I'm complicit in reifying carcerality and surveillance culture in my role as an educator. How am I monitoring my students? How am I evaluating my students? But also, what am I doing to create spaces that are more free? And I'm excited to imagine what that looks like with all of y'all here today.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Yeah, Tavae, do you want to share a little bit?
Sure. So I think you had asked a question about tell us about yourself and then also the impacts of policing and carcerality. And I love so much of what you all have shared and have so much respect for your work. So in Samoan, the phrase "Oi loingo," right? Who is your name? Is also this piece of understanding that when you say my name, you say who I'm connected to, who I belong to. And so if you ask me about myself, I'll tell you, I am Vesi Malaitea Te'evale and Samuelu's granddaughter. I'm Simeon and Ilaua's daughter. especially when I'm in Long Beach, particularly when I'm in Long Beach. I am, Lonnie, Brandon, Mikey, Alawa, and Lavania's auntie. You will see them. You probably already have throughout this webinar. Welcome to my parents' dining room table, and thank you for welcoming me into your homes as well. I am Vanessa and Vika and Milo's best friend. And my most recent title is executive director, and it's probably the one that I'm most uncomfortable with. But as you were reading my bio, I was sitting with like, why did I include those things? And I included those things not because they'll tell you who I am, but it's important in a discussion about abolition that I state my relations, and we talk about it in the concept of power. Like, where is my power? Where is my positionality? And what do I have access to? In owning that and naming that and being really clear, because these relationships and who I belong to are also the folks that I'm most accountable to, and they are the people who have taught me and shaped my perceptions of power. They're also the people who taught me abolition. So, it's May. I'm most familiar with May as Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. I love, Simeon, that you have now introduced me to Abolition May. It will from here on out only be Abolition May for me. And also to share, like, this is the panel I was most excited about of all the things I'm overcommitted to. It's also, in all humility, the one I felt least qualified for. And that statement comes from a place of humility, but also recognizing the ways that I police myself. Of finding myself last night sitting and trying to cram for abolition. Like, oh, how do I study it? How do I come here and measure up? And so much of what you shared too, Vanessa, around policing, the first thing I thought about actually in reflecting on my experiences as a student, what feels like forever ago, was that all of the school officers were men of color, right? And thinking about how often we're actually called on to diversify empire. And also knowing that that's on the side of things like the incredible gendered aspect of it. That the first things I thought of too were what it means as a woman, and especially a woman in a Pacific Islander culture, of what the policing started early. Police started very early and being really clear about the carcerality and the notions that were projected onto my own body and my own performance of gender, and how quickly that started. And I share this piece too, and I think we'll talk about it more. I also love and am really ruminating on your opening side of the ties between policing and militarism and imperialism, because that's also where I'm sitting with this most. That what I know and am most familiar with and can recognize immediately is policing and surveillance. What's harder for me to see is abolition. And so my work in community right now has been study around all of the ways abolition has already been part of our culture. And when I say our, I mean Pacific Islander culture. That actually policing and carcerality are part of our colonial inheritance. And that what is most natural for us is abolition, is freedom. And the ways that policing and carcerality have facilitated the breaking of relationships. And as a highly relational people, how do we understand policing as part of cultural genocide, as well as the literal genocide of our people and how we get to be with each other?
Thank you so much for that, Tavae. That was very poignant and very necessary. Yeah, I mean, I think me personally, I'm also a son of a refugee father coming from Cambodia. And so a lot of this that everyone mentioned definitely resonates with me. Even in my own growing up, I realized my father shielded me from a lot of, the surveillance and the policing, and he tried to, make the best for me. So it's very, close to close to me to be talking about this. But yeah, so moving on to the next question. How did you get introduced to abolition, and how do you practice it? Abolition is really an expansive practice. And so, yeah, we just want to know how you see abolition in your own life. So I guess we can start with Maggie.
Thank you. So I'm just gonna read off my script because I'm not good at speaking from my heart, so don't mind me. So I learned about abolition through my AP US history teacher. He is an activist, and so he taught us about anti-slavery abolition movement, and it's all connected to that. So when we look at current abolition work, it's a continuation of anti-slavery abolition, as all of these systems were created and continue to be anti-Black at their core. I always felt that policing was harmful to my community because of my experience with police as a youth. So whenever I had activities where we had to imagine our ideal community, I remember I never thought that we needed to create a police station or we needed police in this community. And so when I was in college at UCSD in the early 2010s, I guess the new Jim Crow was published. There was a lot of energy around organizing against the police state. So that's where I learned through organizing with the Student Affirmative Action Committee at UCSD. That's when I learned more about abolition, the statistics of prisons being constructed in California, as Vanessa mentioned, privatizations of prisons. I remember the very week after we were at UC Davis for the Students of Color Conference, student organizers were pepper sprayed by the police and it went viral online. I remember when I was wearing flip-flops at 7 a.m. to take over Click's library, which is now Galbraith Hall, and the police were there waiting for us. The first time I voted was in Price Center for yes on Prop 47, which was one of the first policies that passed towards decarceration in California. When I was still in UCSD in 2013 and thinking about returning to LA to work in schools, I heard about LAUSD banning suspensions for willful defiance, which was a landmark decision at that time. And so that's when I also heard about restorative justice as an alternative to discipline. So I was really interested coming out of school to learn more about these alternatives that were coming out. And so I entered the classroom as a TA in my own high school in LAUSD right after I graduated. But there was such a huge gap between this ideal and how it's actually practiced, especially in traditional schools. When I entered the classroom, restorative justice training is mandated in LAUSD. So I was given one hour training on it and saw how watered down it was. I saw security get called on my students. My students left in the middle of class to meet with their probation officers, and a respected white teacher also say to her classroom that she really didn't believe in this new restorative justice thing. And sometimes she just wished that she could suspend some students like the good old times. I also saw how LASPD, so LAUSD has their own school department. So that's really weird for me too, but it was even bigger, and with their own office at the school and with a dozen officers gathering in front of school every day. That's what welcomed me. So I knew I had to leave the school. And so I'm really glad that I was able to join KGA, because a lot of the groundbreaking, amazing things that I've learned in college, KGA was practicing on the ground. And so KGA, as I mentioned before, has always held abolition as one of its values, even if it wasn't called that, right? So like Tavae said, like, some of our cultures have been practicing abolition before we even had a word for it, right? And so they know, KGA knew that policing harms their families and communities, and they knew that they had to create a system centered around community care. So at KGA, we practice grassroots community organizing as a tool for social change. We do this through leadership development of youth, direct action, and campaigning. Our holistic development model includes political education and skills building. So our youth have the critical analysis to identify the root cause of the issues that impact their lives, and they get to be at the forefront of organizing the issues that impact them most. And so part of putting abolition into practice is first educating ourselves and seeing the root cause of the issue, that the police do not serve a positive purpose and do not protect and serve us. And thus we must imagine something new. And the people who are involved in the creation must be the people who are most effective. So KGA was a part of Prop 47, as I mentioned before, and we're also pushing for more. My time's up, so I have to figure out what I was trying to say. But we also practice abolition every day through deeply organizing with our community and through relationship building. And we reject harsh disciplinary practices. And it's important for us to not always be on the defense too, right? So we're coming from a place of wanting to create the world we want to see and the world we think we deserve, and not necessarily just responding to the places that we've been placed in. Yeah, so that's well.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. That was really powerful. Imagination is very expansive and super necessary in the work that you do. Vanessa, do you want to go ahead and speak?
Yeah. I'm so glad Maggie went first, because I think Maggie has already shared a lot of the thoughts I wanted to share. So thank you, Maggie. I also really resonated with what Tavae said, because I also felt a lot of anxiety coming into this space and thinking like, I'm not qualified to speak about this. I need to read up on some shit before I show up in this space. I think my introduction to abolition is still ongoing and is still occurring. I still feel very new to abolition, but I think part of that is the conditioning I've experienced under a carceral system, under a capitalist system, under a neoliberal system, where I feel like I have to be qualified by certain things to say certain things. And I recognize that in abolitionist spaces where our relationships are centered, that's not true, right? I think if you come with care and compassion and abundance, abolitionist spaces will always be open to you and welcoming to you. I think something that is really important about abolition that I'm coming to learn is that it is a way of living. It is a process. It's not necessarily just an end goal, and that it really is about an everyday practice. I think some other folks have shared, I think I've always engaged in abolition work without realizing it or even knowing there was a word. A couple of us in this space come from refugee communities, and I think we've always engaged in collective care and mutual aid. Like that was just the way life was, right? And then to go into public school systems, go into other spaces and realize that other people didn't function that way, I think was a really stark contrast for me. And I've had to do a lot of work to bring myself back to that space, to remember my communities have always done this. This is not new. This has always existed. And we have always been the ones to keep each other safe. Police don't do that. I think specifically at UCSD, I was introduced to more direct abolition work through the work of graduate students pushing for a cost of living adjustment. And I can send some links in the chat later for folks who are interested in learning more about COLA, cost of living adjustment movement, that took place across all the UC campuses before COVID. And I got to meet other students, faculty, and staff who not only wanted a COLA, but they were imagining an entirely different type of university. And that was so powerful for me because I didn't realize how limited my imagination was, right? I was like, okay, I want culturally relevant curriculum. Like that was the thing. That was like the thing that was important in higher ed. But then I realized there's so much more, right? Like a culturally relevant curriculum isn't gonna fix what's happening. Maybe there isn't anything that we can actually fix at the university. Maybe we need to give up on the university. And these were like the questions that I actually got to talk about and actually got to discuss and answer with these other people. And I felt so free having those conversations, would have hours having those conversations. And there wouldn't be any responses of people coming back to me and saying, Vanessa, like, I'm sorry, you got to get back to grading because none of this stuff is important. Like it was so nice to be validated and valued by folks to say, like, you know, that there are other ways and other possibilities of existing together because we already have models for that. Part of this work introduced me to something called the People's University, which I can also paste in the chat later. But I kind of see that as like a weekly study group that has gone on for like a year now, maybe, Simeon. Like it's been a while that we've been together. And a lot of what happens in this space is, again, imagining what an abolitionist university looks like. It's a space that centers our relationships to each other. It's a space where we are accountable for one another, right? Like we have hard conversations and sometimes people got to call each other out in this space, but we know we always show up for each other, right? Because we all have a goal of moving towards imagining different relationships and keeping each other safe. And I think it's also been a space that's been valuable for me because I'm not just thinking about carcerality, policing, surveillance, settler colonialism as separate pockets. I'm thinking about how they maintain each other, how they're related to each other, and how they maintain other systems of oppression. I think also before I wrap up, I also wanted to bring attention, because I think this is a good space to do it, to a recent event that happened in La Jolla, California, that I think a lot of folks in this space are organizing for, where one of our houseless neighbors, Jesse Evans, was beaten by San Diego Police Department by allegedly urinating in public. So I think that as we're thinking about prisons, abolition, carcerality, I think we should also think about how it's impacting other communities of color, specifically Black folks in California, and how as a result of prisons, as a result of surveillance, what it is doing to create spaces where folks don't even have spaces to stay safely. So I'm going to drop a GoFundMe in the chat in a bit if you're interested in contributing to helping our houseless neighbor, Jesse Evans, for his emergency hotel and legal fees. So shout out there to close off.
Yeah, thank you for that, Vanessa. Yes, education, mindful education, specific education is liberatory. So thank you so much for talking about your experience with that. Tavae, do you want to go ahead and talk?
Sure. So two things before I start answering the question about my introduction to abolition. I heard two things in what Vanessa was sharing that I want to reflect back and really kind of sit with. Was one, this notion around abolition is not a philosophical project. And there's a lot of ways that because of how I was introduced to it, I have treated it that way for a really long time. And I was sharing, right, about feeling undefined for this. A lot of it also comes from my, being baptized in the martyrdom, student organizing, or really organizing in general, that often has, right, like it's abolitionist in its politic, but not in its praxis. Because there were so many ways that we policed each other to see if we were down enough. The other pieces I was hearing, right, well, let me just jump into my answer about my introduction to abolition, is that it happened really through Angela Davis reading Ruthie Wilson Gilmore in Professor Victoria Robinson's ethnic studies class. And then it was probably, she was the first professor to ever talk about incarceration and also explicitly tell all of us as students about these things. And as I was sitting with it, it was also the first class that at the time, she had really challenged us to talk about and think like, how does this show up in your communities? And so what I had been looking into was how the state of Hawaii had been sending Native Hawaiians to a private prison in Arizona. And what does that mean to be sending Native people off land, off island, to divorce them from their land, knowing that the pillars of Pacific Islander identity are land, language, and family, and how quickly the incarceration also disrupts that as well. And that thinking about the ways that incarceration and prisons were then a critical tool for colonization, right? And that many who do abolition work in Hawaii can tie the overthrow of the monarchy directly to the increased incarceration of Native people. That to this day, Native Hawaiians account for 40% of the incarcerated population in Hawaii. And so I want to also shout out and name Corona Care and the Hawaii Community Bail Fund, who for Hawaiian Independence Day on November 20th, got together and raised money to free, right? They saw, one, that the high rates of coronavirus that were literally killing their people in incarceration, as well as the fact that they were being put inside anyway, right? So how do we also understand incarceration and prisons and policing as anti-Indigenous, right? The ways that it's used to dispossess people of their land and culture and language and access to community. So I also want to know and think about this other piece of, as I'm talking about the formal, like I recognized it and could articulate it as art, as abolition, and then noting, right, that I believe, right, that abolition was birthed at the moment of slavery, of policing, right? Because I can't imagine that any of our people just said, okay, that if you came for anybody, decided to enslave anybody, decided to imprison anyone, that we were okay with it, right? That when I think about abolition and its historical, its genealogy in our communities, I'm very clear that it started from the second that oppression started to, right? That resistance was immediate.
Yeah, thank you, Tavae. It's really important to recognize that abolition has different lineages in all of our communities, and it's very specific. That abolition is not just, this white savior kind of project. So thank you for bringing that up. And then Paul, do you want to go ahead and finish up the question for us?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think came into abolition, I want to say, as a matter of necessity. It wasn't even a choice for me personally, I think in part just from having sat in a box for many years, concrete and rebar. It's not, I don't know, it's not there to do anything but to keep you in a place, right? Confine you. Places no bigger than your bathroom, probably smaller than some folks' bathrooms, to be honest, and to put two men in a cell like that. And so spending many years in a place like that, and then not even getting to walk free when I'm like supposed to go free, right? And so I think just the personal experience pushed me in a sense of a different direction. But ultimately at the end of the day though, it's having sat there and just seeing impacts it's done on people, seeing impacts on the community. And at the end of the day, there was something that I really reflected on while I was there, was that it's not designed to give anybody any kind of healing or anything. They think of the system as a place of the penitentiary, which is an old idea. It's a place for somebody to go penitent and think about what they've done and all this other stuff. But how do you do that if you just throw you in a box and shut the door on you and deprive you of everything else, right? We're social human beings. We need human contact. Those are conditions that actually make people worse, exacerbate conditions. They don't even do what they were thought to do from the beginning of time. But ultimately, at the end of the day, like these systems are built, we can go all the way back to when the British came over here, right? We can go all the way there to the displacement of folks. We can go to the first laws of citizenry on the US, right? The free white person that's specifically named. You can go look at it. In 1790, the first Congress of the United States specifically said you cannot be a citizen and benefit from their colonies and all of that they're creating this country unless you were a free white person. I mean, that speaks a million tones, doesn't it? And so like realizing all of that and seeing that's the kind of system I had to buck up against, right? Like all these resources came against me, with me just stuck in a box and going to see an immigration judge and dealing with a nice trained lawyer, right? And talking about INA 236, 237, blah, 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 blah. Having to teach myself all the legalities to get out of the prison to begin with, and then getting out of ICE and other kind of things, right? But at the end of the day, I think abolition, through YJC, I can sum it up in something really, really simple. No new cops, no new cash, no new cages. That's it. Anything that advances that, I think you're going in a direction that's moving towards abolition, right? We're trying to reduce the system. We're trying to starve it. Trying to support folks and not build up an infrastructure. The largest network of jails and prisons, LA County being the biggest one, having in the county jail system, it has a history of 17,000 people on an average daily population, the highest in the world, worse than China, Iraq, Iran, you name it. The highest in the world is in LA County. That's crazy. That's here in California. All right, let's think about that. That's nuts. Yeah, so abolition, I think at YJC is like moving away from that, breaking those down. We're in a bunch of different spaces. We're in a bunch of different coalitions, whether we're trying to stop jail expansion in LA County, which we were successful partnerships in doing that, whether it's ending fines and fees, which we've been successful at in LA County, and also at the state level. We're trying to move more to retain people's wealth. Civil assessments is something big on the radar. Ending ICE transfers was something that I've been working on for quite a while. And right now looking good in terms of state prisons being included, right? And this is like really progressive forward thinking, right? How do we really divest from these systems and how do we break them down? And the young folks at YJC have asked for a long time to take away from policing. They've been saying it before it was popular, before people started saying defund the police. They have been saying that. They've been talking about LA for youth. We want 5% of the money you spend on every cop, every judge, every DA, every probation officer. As a matter of fact, we want you to get rid of probation. And young folks are already moving in that direction because of the young folks at YJC really led that a long time ago. But set those seeds for what's starting to grow and basically a rose that's growing out of concrete, right, in many ways. Yeah, and abolition it's just a way of life. Honestly, it's more than a philosophy. It is a way of life. It's a lifestyle to me, to be honest. But I think in everyday life, right? Like my work makes it easy. I'm running all kinds of bills, whatever. But how do you do it in your local neighborhoods, right? How do you do it there? It's as simple as going down to the street. You could be doing houseless folks outreach, right? Making sure they don't get caught up in having to rely on a system of government infrastructure to support them. How do we pull them away from that, right? Whether you just go out and give a pizza box, whether you go out with a brand new tent, simple things, right? Whether it's just giving them kits so they don't have to, go to places and have to go pee somewhere or whatever it is that's causing them to get like these types of enforcements are coming on them. These are the simple things you can do, right? Giving somebody $1 somewhere. It's little things. You have no idea what you're doing, right? It may seem mundane, but if you really think about the effects and the possibilities of that simple transaction, think about the possible outcomes and the linkages to that and how you pull them away from the system. Ultimately, at the end of the day, those are the things that you can do, right? Folks are out here doing mutual aid. Folks are making calls on bills that we're trying to run at YJC, and folks do it. That's practicing forms of abolition, right? It's as simple. Sometimes it's just email, right? So it's simple, little mundane things, but so many people practice it without knowing it. So just want to encourage folks to think about how can you do things towards realizing your imagination of living in a world where society cares for everyone and you live on those principles. How do we do actions in our own lives every single day to get to a place where everybody can be 2-year-olds again? I say 2-year-olds because I want you to think about any 2-year-old. Would they ever pick up a gun or a knife to harm somebody? Would they ever do those things? That's the way humanity was born. You'll see a white 2-year-old run up to a black 2-year-old and hug them with no problems. Right? You'll see a 2-year-old climb every shelf to get the last Cheerio to feed somebody, their next door neighbor, because they're hungry. That's what we're born to do as people. That's what humanity came into this world as. It's society. It's these old institutions, these Quakers and Pilgrims and all of that. It's the Puritans that created a system, created Boston Latin School, you know, and you can look all that up, you know, like these are all things that in reality, white, Western, European colonists created. It's a society that they want. And if you don't comply with that, they want to get rid of you and oppress you. So they use their voices quietly to hold us down. So we have to be loud through abolition to rise up above that and make that noise to get free.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really loved all of those responses. Abolition as practice, as not an end goal, right? It's something that we inhabit, embody, and as Paul said, like maybe it's also unlearning the violence that we're kind of socialized into practicing. So this is actually a really good segue to the next question. So abolition, in some ways, we should be skeptical of like so-called wins, right? Because if we think abolition as practice and not an end goal that can be achieved like overnight, like wins, right? We should be skeptical of them. But yet, as Paul was saying, like there are very concrete things that we should be doing and that we should celebrate when we do it, right? So just as an example, like the Derek Chauvin trial, right? The verdicts, the results of that being construed as justice or win, I think is short-sighted, right? Or it can be problematic. But nonetheless, I want to pose this question to each of you. Like, what are some of the wins that you celebrate that makes abolition seem possible for you? And this is also a question of thinking about the ways that wins are ways to show people what's possible and necessary and to pull people into the work of abolition, right? So to many of our attendees, right? And also I see some of my students in the attendees. I know a lot of people are really inspired by the work, but also don't necessarily know how to get plugged in or how to get involved, right? How do you pull people in? So can I call on Vanessa? Do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I honestly struggled with this question because I was thinking like, oh my goodness, how do I share like this big win that gets people excited to want to get involved in abolition? And I had to sit myself down and really reflect on what wins mean. And I think I realized that in abolition work, the wins aren't necessarily frequent. I think the way we think about wins traditionally as prizes, as successes, all these things, as grants, awards, blah, blah, blah. I don't think those often happen in abolition work, but I think that is also good because I think it tells us that wins don't always need to be big and flashy. And that we actually experience wins in abolitionist work every single day in the relationships that we build, right? When I go to a meeting and someone who is new to that meeting shows up the next week, that is a win for me. Like that's huge that I built that relationship. And I think the wins that we really have to focus on are the ones that sustain us and not necessarily these big events. I'm thinking of two specific experiences I had. The first one actually occurring this past Wednesday at UCSD. We hosted an event called Abolition Square. Simeon was deeply involved in that. Aaron was deeply involved in that. There were some other people in the space deeply involved in it. And I loved it so much because it was a celebration. A celebration that we had each other. Like there was free food from POC businesses. There were books on abolition in prisons that you could just take. Like there was a free library, and we had to explain to people that you could just walk up and take a book, and people were like, I don't understand. On a college campus, I have to buy all my books. What is going on? So to like explain a different type of relationship was really fun to folks. There was art creation, and there was just such an abundance of joy. Like it was such a wonderful space to be in, and it was filled with just so much love. And I remember one particular conversation with a student that I used to have who like came by because I was her TA, and she was like, why are you here, Vanessa? Like, what are you doing? Why are you on campus? This is so weird. And I was letting her know a little bit about the event, and to see this moment of recognition in her eye about how she experiences carcerality in the classroom, right? She's like, oh yeah, like my professors do discipline me. I did see that information about Jesse Evans. I understand what you all are talking about, and it was such a big win for me, because I think a lot of people intimately understand and know what carcerality is, and that they experience it every day. They just haven't necessarily been able to have a conversation about it. I also think about another win I had with my mom, because I think abolitionist work has also made me more attentive to my relationship with my family, and how I may be engaging in surveillance with my family too, and policing with my family. And I remember I went home for Cambodian New Year's, for Khmer New Year's, to celebrate. And I was reading a book called the Care Manifesto. And it's a really like small, tiny little book. And my mom was like, aren't you a PhD student? Why are you reading such a little book that it has like a pink cover? So I was telling her about the book, and I read a sentence to her, and she's like, oh yeah, like that makes sense. Like we already do this. And it was a huge win, because she got it. And I always knew she would get it, because she's always done this type of work without realizing it. But to extend that conversation beyond the classroom, beyond people who are in university spaces, is huge for me. And it just makes me reflect on and think about how abolition is possible because we're here. All of us in this space are here. Abolition is possible because we have always been here, and because others have moved us forward to do this work. So we are living proof, I think, that abolition is possible. And that we can do it together.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Centering this notion that relationships and the relationships we're building is itself like a win that that's like hard to quantify, right? Yeah, thank you. Tavae, do you want to share next?
Could you actually go to Maggie while I pull up some of the images, please?
Yeah, of course. Maggie.
Or Paul even, like, I don't know if you want to go first. Okay. Yeah, Vanessa's story reminds me of like my dad. So my dad has been stuck in the house for the whole year. He's over 65, so he's just like so bored. And the only people he sees are my neighbors next door. Like he walks down the street and says hi to all our neighbors who speak Spanish. And so when I go out, he says, oh, be very careful, because like you don't know what's going to happen with all of the violence happening. But he also says, don't worry about our neighbors though. Don't worry about our neighborhood though, because they have our backs. He really feels that way, and he says it too. Like yesterday, I heard him say like our neighbors are so great. So I think a lot of abolition work and like a win to celebrate is the relationships and the deep like community that we build. And part of like KGA's work is like creating the leaders who have been most impacted, like centering the folks who have been most impacted, so that they are able to create the change. They are able to create the systems that represent them. So I want to celebrate the young people we work with who are stepping into their power, who are engaged in their community, in social justice, creating solutions, standing in solidarity, and taking action for all people of color. And one of the stories I remember is like my first time door knocking with KGA. I was taught by a youth, like I would have never door knocked like on my own. But I had to like model it, but my youth modeled it for me. And we were door knocking for Prop 57, which is a expansion of sorts of Prop 47. And one of our youth met a community member who said that he was recently released from prison. And because of Prop 47, which we had fought for, he could finally vote for the first time. And he was eager to have his voice heard, right? And these are the stories whenever we door knock that our youth like really is ingrained in their memory, that they get to know their community, they get to see people like their families, and they get to see what work they're really fighting for. And so we have a lot of stories from Get Out the Vote. And so it's very precious that we're able to build with our community members, and also that our youth are able to tell the community members and reflect to them that they also have power too. And another major win to celebrate is, of course, our Invest in Youth campaign, which is really, really long. So KGA is an anchor organization of a coalition. It's multiracial, it's youth-based with other orgs such as Californians for Justice, Long Beach Forward, Genders and Sexualities Alliance Network, and many more. And so I'll try to drop links, I guess, so people can get plugged in. But what it was really intended to be a way to divest from police and really create the funding resources to get the services and resources necessary for youth to thrive. It's like really demanding that people invest in youth because we haven't seen that. And so we found that Long Beach, like before everyone started looking at budgets, we were looking at budgets and trying to make sense of it. And Long Beach spends at that time, Long Beach spent 44% of their general fund on LBPD, which is a shame. It's increased since then too. And for every youth incarcerated, they spent over $10,000 per youth incarcerated. And then they invested in positive youth development. The investment was 100 per youth, which is like such a shame because we know that most of the youth arrests happened in the districts that our youth live in, which are mostly young people of color. And so our youth like showed out, they door knocked, they surveyed the community, and they were able to reflect that 7 out of 10 residents, we surveyed like 757 people, and 7 out of 10 residents believed in like investing in greater public funding for youth programs, such as academic programs, job training, youth leadership, and youth development. And then, and even the people who like said that they supported the police, because we door knocked, we were able to hear, like, I remember a resident told me, oh, like, I want to support the police because the police were in our neighborhood council meeting saying they didn't show up for calls because they didn't have enough money. And I was able to say, that's cap, they have lots of money, right? So even that, it's like very important to build that community so that we're able to stop that misinformation, that fake news, and build like meaningful connections so that people who would support us are like aware of how they can get plugged in. And so long story short, we won in February, like we said. We created the Long Beach Youth Fund. And like we said, it's not just like a win because it doesn't end there. Right now we're in the implementation phase, but we do want to celebrate because so many youth put in the work. And I remember all of the stories too, like over the last 5 years. And this is accumulation of so much that they've built. And so that's one thing. I'll try to plug in some of the stuff, but like, how do people who want to get plugged into abolition work, what steps that they can take? It's important to educate yourself because there's a lot of learning and unlearning to be done. But fortunately, there's a lot of resources out there. Always remember to start with your own community, whether it's your university, your neighborhood. Abolition is not new, so it's important to find those organizations and people already engaged in the work, and then also tap into your own strengths, your own talents, and your own gifts that you're willing to offer the movement, right? So I'll just.
Love that. Thank you, Maggie. Congratulations on getting that youth fund and for sharing that. Should I go with Paul and then Tavae? Let's do that. All right, Paul. Yeah, what are some wins and like how do you?
I think wins go back a long way, right? Let's just think about California. 30 years ago, folks were talking about Prop 187. Look where we are now, kind of the opposite of it. You know, not entirely, but you know, in significant ways. I think a personal win though for me is just having gotten a pardon in record time. When the governor's office originally told me, read the email part in bold, that basically said politely, you haven't been out 10 years yet, good luck. Got it. Right, when somebody comes home and they say, hey, did you work on this bill? Yeah, I worked on the bill. Man, appreciate you. I'm here because of that bill. Right, those things come through. Or when parents come home and say, hey, my child's coming out of ICE, appreciate your help. Right, these things always have significance. Randomly one time, I got this call from a family in Florida. I don't know how they got my number or whatever, but they got my number, they found me. And it took a couple of years, but got, one of the parents out of ICE and got him a green card. And so, I think those are kind of the precious wins. I think the personal kind of one-to-ones, the impacts, right? It's one thing to win legislation, like YJC has a strong history of winning legislation and changing policies. We don't really tackle the city too much because it's too much bureaucracy and little impact. We don't tackle the county all the time, even though it's bigger wins, but sometimes we have to go to the state to even get the win in the county or at the city because they refuse to do it. So we have to go beyond that, right? And so we venture up to the Capitol, we're hitting doors, getting our own bills sponsored, we find our own authors, et cetera, work with others to get stuff authored. And, we're always thinking about how do we move power away from policing? How do we move power away from cages? How do we move power away from, the deportation machine? How do we change the funding structures? How do we get, community on board as voting members inside, spaces that are able to deal with money, just like for example, Juvenile Justice Coordinating Council. Many people don't know it exists, but it does. And in LA County, they get about $30 million every year to figure out what to do. We got young people on there. Somebody from YJC is on there, somebody from ARC and other orgs are on there, right? Well, folks have to fight for that to get that representation. And so I think those are also wins when you're able to put folks in spaces, right? I ended up getting into CalVIP to an executive steering committee, sitting in a room with a lot of probation chiefs and a police chief of Santa Cruz, sitting there and politely telling them that the badge is not always the answer. Your firearm is not always the answer either. Let's think about this pot of money you're getting and where you're putting it to. Here's my suggestion for a request for proposal to CBOs, or whatever, right? Being in spaces like that and being able to not just be at the table. I want folks to think when you're at the table, you can also be part of the dinner plate. You need to be at the table equitably with everybody else as a decision maker. So how do we impact the community there? So those are like some of the things I think of as wins, although there's a bunch to it. But I just want folks to encourage folks to think about this. Abolition is not merely just a removal of cages or the policing apparatus. It's about removing and eradicating the societal issues that plague our communities, right? That cause people to struggle, cause people to be oppressed, surveilled, and all of that. You got to think beyond that, right? We got to imagine a bigger world. But plugging in, I always say, go find a place that you're most comfortable at, whether it's YJC, KGA, whatever, I don't care, right? But go find a place that sits right with you. But make sure that those principles that they abide by are the principles that you also abide by. Don't go plug into a place that does work that you don't agree with. That's kind of stupid, to be honest. I'm gonna just be out front with folks because I see people do it and then they're upset at the end of it, talking to me. And I'm like, hey, you knew they were like this. Why'd you go over there? I don't know what to tell you. This is right. So every input that we provide of our labor has a consequence. It has an outcome. So I encourage folks to think about what that input and that outcome will be, right? Because you're investing your life, you're investing your hopes and your dreams into this work. And so I just want to steer folks in that direction to make it worthwhile for you and to make it worthwhile for the goal of abolition. But if you want to plug into YJC, you can check out our website at youthjusticela.org. A lot of the design, I'm working on the website. So if you see something wrong, hey, I'm working on it. Just give me some time here. But I've been working on it a lot. We have our campaigns page up. We have a directory so you can find folks' emails if you want to get in touch with particular folks on particular issues. Check out our website and social media at Youth Justice LA. You can see calls to action, you can see bills we're working on. Check out our link tree in the bio. And younger folks gravitate towards Instagram and graphics, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not the young person at YJC. I just want to let folks know that too. I'm just back there to support the young folks, right? And always lifting up their demands and always putting those forward, right? Regardless. So every space that I go to, I come back and report back to them, and I'm held accountable to them, right? Because they're the folks that gave me the love and the space that I needed when I needed a party and needed a solution for my liberation. There wasn't a lot of these bigger ticket organizations, to be honest with y'all. They either kick me out, threw me to the curb, or say, give us 5 or 6 years. I was like, yeah, I got a deportation order. I might have 90 days, you know, but they didn't understand all that. And the young folks at YGC totally did open up their arms, embrace me. And so here I am. So just here to reciprocate that. So much love to everybody that's young out there in the movement. The stage is yours. The world will be yours in just a few years. Think about that. Not to take up too much time. Hands off.
Thanks, Paul. And yeah, feel free to drop any resources, any of our presenters, if you want to share your links, feel free to drop it in the chat. Tavae, do you want to share some of your wins and yeah?
Yeah, thank you. I'm laughing at so much of what Paul is sharing, right? One, I'm always really struck by when I'm sitting around, I'm like, oh shit, I'm the adult in the room. So in that weird in between of often being like the youngest person at a table full of PI elders and then going to another space and actually kind of needing to morph. And so the relative nature of youth and young, but I digress. So the question was around wins. And I wanted to show you all and share some images. And these images really came out of Epic or myself. We were approached by Race Forward I want to say sometime last year in the summer, and we're asked like, hey, do you want to do an AAPI gathering about abolition? And I sat with it and was really disheartened at, you know, of all of the networking and work that Epic has done, I could not think of more than 2 PI abolitionists. That was it. Like 2 PIs who are out there saying things that the loudest actually voices of community leaders were not abolitionists. We're actually not all, you know, we're more likely, and actually many of them saying things like not all cops. And really challenging Epic around our positions about defunding police, about abolition work. And so as they were asking us to participate in this gathering, I was like, oh shit, like I don't even know who would come. I don't even know who we could put together. And so we sent out the call far and wide, and we had this gathering in December. And it was the most beautiful and sacred space that we've ever held, right? Like it was unapologetically Pacific Islander. We opened with a blessing from, you know, Havane Rios, who is a Mauna Kea protector in Kia'i, and the pule that she did in Native Hawaiian, like it just foretold so many things, right? About the long arc towards abolition, but also the cyclical nature of it. Because we've had it before, we will return to it, that's inevitable. But these illustrations were done by an artist that we invited to create a graphic based on the discussions that we were having. And so if you want to follow her on IG, it's Mo Molino Studio. So MOEMELINO Studio. And so Mo created these, and I think it really illustrates a lot of what folks have brought up today. I love Maggie's point around imagination, right? And there's so much in this that is indicative of that. I love, you know, Vanessa, when you were sharing too about where you've been pushed beyond thinking about curriculum, that in these spaces, in these discussions, folks made really clear white supremacy and capitalism will not set the upper limit for our freedom, right? And a lot of things that we get challenged about are like, how do we actually think beyond what we know? And what I've also been sitting with in all of my ethnic studies training and education is that studying struggle meant that I became an expert in oppression. And so I've had to work harder to grow that expertise in liberation. So I love this illustration, right? Because you see these hands that are raising out of the water of like, okay, this is what it looks like to get free. These are the things that it will take. And I want to share this other illustration that came out. So you'll see it's a group of Pacific Islander women who are weaving this mat. And each thing that they're weaving in are all of the things that people named, right? To Paul's point of how do we actually create the conditions for our people to survive, knowing that in a police state, they will outlaw your survival so that your very existence is criminal, right? The fact that you have lived makes you illegal. And so what are the things we put in place, right? So that when people are saying prison is the answer, that we come back and say like, actually, if you provide people with these basic needs, they'll be fine. Like that's the answer. And that all of these things I'd love, especially to demonstrate to our communities and specific communities that abolition is part of our heritage. It's part of our genealogy, far more than policing and military, right? And that the other thing that we discussed really clearly is knowing the ways that this trope of the warrior gets deployed in our communities, right? That they will tell our people, right? Especially, right? They'll tell our young men, you are a warrior, and then recruit them for empire to police the world, right? And so what we remind them with these illustrations, with these discussions about abolition, like you're also a healer, you're also a voyager, you are also a storyteller. And if you are a warrior, then fight for us. To be really clear about which side that they're on, that they are not fighting for us, right? That they've been weaponized for white supremacy. And having those conversations to pull folks back in, that like the ways, how do we give them alternatives too? Because the other conversations that we've had around militarism, knowing that I'm deeply critical of it, and Pacific Islanders are 249% overrepresented in the military. So we show them this as alternatives, right? That these are the ways that you can take care of your people. Now, the other piece that I'll share that I really love and just close with is I was in, oh, I'm gonna stop sharing. We'll get to that later, that adorableness. I was in a clubhouse room and one of the speakers, and it was an Indigenous town hall, and one of the speakers really brilliantly was talking about and said, they have colonization stories, we have creation stories, right? They being white supremacists, colonizers, all the folks who have set up these systems that don't allow us to thrive. And what was really brilliant and beautiful about that is I was sitting and thinking about like, yeah, that is part of it, right? That our people mostly consume colonization stories about ourselves and each other. And to be really clear, right, that when we talk about a decolonial practice, we also mean that policing, prisons, that's a colonization story. The idea that you can't trust people and each other, that's a colonization story. Abolition is a creation story, that we are a people of creation stories, so that we are a people of abolition.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Tavae. That was really beautiful. I really love, I mean, I think art and creation definitely has its place in abolition work. So I know that we've had such a really fruitful conversation, full of, I can just feel, us being in community with each other. And so it's really amazing to do that. But since our time is coming to an end, we don't have too much time left, but we still wanted to touch upon like a final concluding question, which is really something simple, but it has its place. It's really necessary to experience joy and to, that's part of living. And, abolition is, creating a space to live and to thrive. And so we just wanted to know, what gives you joy and what do you do to sustain and nurture yourself through all of it? So anyone can go. Yeah.
So I can kick us off. YGC, we also have a high school on site. A lot of folks don't know that. We actually do have a high school on site. Alternative high school, we don't have police and all that stuff. And every year we have a graduation just so students graduate, right? Students that otherwise have been discarded by the public school systems, or we support them, nurture them and they grow up and they go on to do great things, go to college, go find a career, and do fine. Ain't nothing wrong with these young people like the system thinks there is, pathologizing them. So it always brings me joy to see them graduate, to see them like putting on a cap and gown when the system said, you're never gonna get there. You're gonna be in a cage, in a box by the time you turn 18, 19, 20. But here they are. So that always brings me joy. But what sustains me in terms of like YJC work, we're a 501c3, but we don't operate as a 501c3. And so that's an interesting place. We always operate side by side. Folks may have titles or whatever, but we all operate together. Same plane, same level, everything's participatory, whether it's our budget, whether it's hiring of new teachers, that students get to basically pick and choose who they hire as teachers. What school do you see doing that? We actually ask our students, hey, you want to hire this person for the teacher? We have a teacher opening. No, okay, too bad, sorry. Hey, students don't want you. See ya. We have to find another person. I don't know what to tell you. But yeah, so those are things that bring me joy because we are living in a way that is possible. And it sustains me because we do it every day, no matter how hard it is. Folks stick it through and build with one another and go hang out and go river rafting once in a while. And go do crazy stuff, hop in the water, almost drown together and all kinds of things. But that's how we build with people, right? We're not professional organizers. Most of us at YJC don't have degrees. Well, our organizing crew, hardly anybody has a degree. Everybody's barely out of high school for the most part sometimes, right? So it's possible to live the impossible. Makes life worth living.
I can go since I sort of already started. I'll show you all the picture that I wanted to share. So this is my 3-year-old niece, Lavanya, who you may hear. The ice cream truck came by, so she's super active. So this is her dress. She's super into costumes. She likes to dress herself. This is her as Buzz Lightyear ballerina. That's the theme of the day. Lavanya is a huge source of joy in this household. We often sit around and exchange stories about her latest antics and her rebellion. She also just, teaches me. She's 3 and she has already outpaced me as far as her boldness. She's anti-carceral as hell. I'm also a terrible disciplinarian. You couldn't tell her, and there's so much that she makes really clear about what it means to listen to your intuition, to listen to your body, to be in good relationship. And she's always telling us all how and when to love her. I think that's the biggest thing. And knowing that like my job and my joy is just protect that, to protect that spirit, right? Like to Paul's point, that she came into this world that way, and I hope she stays for as much as possible in that spirit and in that energy.
I love that. I'll share what's one of my biggest joys is, of course, working with our youth and our staff. They're so cool. I wish you all could meet them. And so I think the way we practice how to care for each other is very healing. And the ways when our youth get to experience culture and arts, it's very healing too. So there's like one member I would like you all to meet. Her name is Marina. And when I was writing my script for everything, I was thinking of her. She has a poem she wrote when she was 15 that she performed. And she goes, tell me, no, let me tell you. And then, so I just love that. She's so fierce. And I just wanted to share a memory of her too. We were at the lagoon and it was really hot. She wasn't wearing any shoes and so her feet were burning, and I offered my socks to her or something, and she says, no, I don't need that. I'm a strong Southeast Asian woman. So I think the fierceness of our youth and their tenderness really brings me joy, and like it really makes me think that like this is how it should be. Like all of our communities should be able to heal and to be able to like live in this type of harmony. Yeah.
Everything has been so beautiful. I mean, I think this space is giving me a lot of joy. Listening to all of you here brings me joy. Knowing that we have audience members who are engaging brings me a lot of joy. Sharing pohok and moklahong, which is papaya salad, and also like this fermented fish paste, people have feelings about it, but it gives me joy. Being loved by my sister scholars and co-conspirators and loving them brings me joy. Pissing off the university brings me joy, honestly. Getting the privilege of doing this necessary work and manifesting imagined futures that our ancestors and elders imagined brings me a lot of joy. And all of this stuff is hard work, and it can be really painful work. But I think to be this type of Imagineer and to be this type of dream maker is really such a joy. So for all the audience members in this space, we need you and we need us. And I really hope that, again, we can imagine all these things together.
Thank you all so much for sharing. Thank you for sharing the space. This really brought me a lot of joy. Just want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time. Want to thank Aaron, my co-facilitator. Want to thank Stephanie for live captioning. Anna Marie, Jen, thank you both so much. And yeah, I really appreciated this conversation and look forward to continuing to build from this, right? And to continue these relationships. So to our attendees, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us.